Well, we're continuing on with our sermon series today on the Trinity. And, we have in the past weeks been talking a lot about our relationship with God. And it's important as we talk about that to understand, well, what exactly is the nature of the God that we have a relationship with? Obviously, that's incredibly important. When I remember when I met Angela and my parents asked me questions about her. They didn't, it wasn't enough for them that they said, hey, you're going to get married and that's great, but they really wanted to know the nature of the person that I was going to get married to. That was kind of important to them. It's not just, you don't just go home and say, hey, Mom and Dad, I'm getting married. And they say, oh, marriage, that's great, right? That's not how it works. They say, well, what's the nature and character of the person that you're entering into this relationship with? Even before that, when you're a kid, you might say, hey, I made a new friend at school today, and your parents might say, hey, that's great. But then the very next thing is they say, well, what kind of person are you friends with? That's kind of important. And so we want to look at who is this God that we worship? Who is this God that we are in a relationship with? And last week we talked about God the Father. We talked about the Father's love for us. And today we're going to talk about the Son. And the important thing to understand about the Son is that the Son shares. And we're going to look at this today and hopefully understand a little bit more about the person of the Son. And so we're going to look at Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. It starts off and it says, long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. Well, today when we look at the Son, we want to look at these three statements. We have three statements today instead of three questions. So the three statements are, the Son shares in the Old Testament, the Son shares through words, and the Son shares in actions. And we're going to be looking at what is the job, really, what is the nature of this second person of the Trinity, the Son. Now, as I said, the first thing we want to look at here is the Son shares in the Old Testament. We want to understand that just because Jesus isn't incarnated in the Old Testament, it doesn't mean that he's not present in the Old Testament. Now, one of the things that we need to do to kind of understand this is I want to give an illustration about how this works. Anybody here a racing fan, like watching racing, any kind of racing, NASCAR racing, IndyCar racing, anyone? Just a little bit? Okay, so one of the things that's weird, I remember seeing this as a kid. I remember that a driver got out of a car really fast and was kind of dancing around next to his car while it was in the pit stop. And I couldn't understand what was happening, and then the announcer said that he was on fire. Now, the problem was you couldn't see the fire. Has anybody ever seen this on TV, on racing? The fuel that race cars burn is so pure that when it catches fire, you cannot see the flames. You just cannot see them. It's a really strange thing. I didn't know, when I was a kid, I didn't know that that was possible. And I thought, for a minute, I was terrified by this idea of being able to be on fire and just nobody can see it. And to me, it just looked like some guy just dancing around, and he was trying to put himself out. Now, this is something really interesting about the nature of light. And for thousands of years, we got light the same way. We got light by burning things. And what's fascinating is that without certain things in the fuel, you actually can't see the light of fire. Now, why is this important? Well, in order to understand the Trinity, you have to understand a simple thing, and that is that spiritual things are not visible. Spiritual things aren't visible. That's what makes them, they're not physical. They're not, and so the thing is, you can't see them. You can't see them, you can't hear them, you can't really detect or understand them. And the only way that you can see anything spiritual is for it to have some kind of manifestation so that it can be seen. And really what's fascinating is that this is, in the Old Testament, God is seen as fire. And the reason that this is really interesting to me is because fire is the same way. If you have a pure enough fuel, the fire can't be seen. The only reason that fire can be seen is there's things in the fire called incandescents. These are materials that when they get hot, they radiate light. Now, it's interesting, in the old times, back in, like, if you lived in the Old West time, and you say you wanted to go out to the theater and watch a play, it was not unusual back in the old days for people to hate going to places like the theater. And the reason for that is because the incandescents that they had only existed in the actual fuel for the fire. So if you had an oil-burning lamp or you had a candle, you had something like that, the incandescents that made the light were only in that. And it wasn't until later that they figured out a way to make the incandescent separate from the fuel. And if you've gone camping, you've probably dealt with this before. How many of you guys have ever gone camping and had one of those Coleman lanterns? Anybody? Okay, a lot of you. Great. You know those little things called the mantles? You know what I'm talking about? Those little things, the little bags that look like they're made out of string. Those are the craziest things ever. Here's the thing that's really fascinating, is this was a huge breakthrough in light. Because what happened is that they separated the incandescents from the fuel so you could have more light without burning more fuel. You see, the reason that in the old times people would go to the theater and they hated it, they would get headaches, because in order to have enough light, they had to burn so much stuff that it actually sucked the oxygen out of the room, and you were being slowly asphyxiated when you went to the theater. Not a pleasant experience. But when they invented mantles, they invented something that glowed and gave off light when it was hot and wasn't the same thing as the flame. It wasn't the same thing as what was burning. And it gave off a huge amount of light, like 10 times as much light as anything that they had up to that point. It's a crazy thing. And what's really interesting is when you first light a mantle, have you seen that? It gets engulfed in flames, and then that flame goes away and it brights. What's happening is there's string. This is more than you ever wanted to know about this, I know. We'll get to Jesus in a minute, okay? When you have these mantles, it's basically string. And in this string, what you have is they've been soaked in kinds of salts. And you burn away the string until all that's left is the salts, and that's what glows. You burn away everything else, and then what's left is the incandescence, and then that's what gives off light. And that's why if you ever have one of those mantles that's been burned and you touch it, it's like it just disappears, right? Because all that's left in that is the stuff that glows, the stuff that gives off light. And that's when it's really bright. That's when those mantles really give off light. Everything that isn't giving off light has been burned away. All that's there is the stuff that radiates light. So why am I telling you this story? Because it helps us to understand the nature of the distinction between the Father and the Son. The Father being Spirit, He's like that fire that's so pure that you can't possibly see it. You need something that manifests to it. And Jesus is the radiance of God. And in fact, it says it right here in verse 3, in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3. It says, He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of His nature. He's the thing, the glory that you can see. He's the glory that is manifest. He's the glory that radiates the true nature of who God is. He's an equal part of the Trinity. It's not like there was never a time when Jesus wasn't radiating who God is. He's co-eternal, and He's an equal part of the Trinity. And as we've talked about, in the Trinity, you have three persons in one God. It's one God. It's not three separate gods, but it's three persons within that God. And that's hard for us to understand, and yet that's actually necessary for the existence of God. Now, one of the things that we have to understand here, and it points out, is that it says in verse 2, through whom also he created the world. Jesus created the world. In John chapter 1, verse 3, it says, all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. Now, why is this? It's because all of creation is part of this thing that reflects the nature and the glory of God. Everything in creation is made for the specific purpose of reflecting the glory of God. The Bible says that the earth is full of God's glory. The heavens declare his glory, his nature. Everything exists for the purpose of doing this. And so it's the sun, the radiance of God, that brings this about. The sun is the one that's responsible for the fact that everything in creation is a reflection or a radiation of God's glory. It's made through him and for him. It declares the glory of God, and Jesus publishes or makes known this glory of God. Now, one of the things that's interesting is glory has one aspect to it that's very interesting. Glory is fame. Now, it's a couple of other things as well. It's light, it's heaviness, but it's also fame. Now, here's a real weird thing. Like when we think about people wanting fame, it's not like we have a good view of that, right? It seems very odd that people would want fame. But here's the thing that we also understand. Is anybody here not so fond of public speaking? Anybody here? Okay, that's fair. Anybody here not so fond of public singing? Okay. What about public dancing? How many of you would like to come up and give us some interpretive dance this morning? Anyone? Oh, okay, good. So here's the thing. Most of us would be very uncomfortable doing that. I feel okay coming up here and talking to you guys, but I wouldn't want to sing in front of you, and you wouldn't want that either. And I definitely would not want to dance in front of you. And believe me, you don't want that either. It would be the most awkward experience that you've ever had. You'd be sorry that it took place. Now, here's the thing. When you do that, how do you know when you're doing a good job or not? Right? How do you know that? How many of you guys remember being a teenager, like junior high, senior high, and you're going to go to a dance and you think to yourself, should I be doing this? How do you know? How do you know whether you should? How do you know whether your dance moves are any good? How do you know? How do you know when you sing whether it's any good? Or how do you know? Right? Because the thing that's interesting is that people's reaction to you is actually a way of knowing yourself. You guys know what I'm talking about? So one of the things that happens when you're in junior high is you're trying to figure out how to do social interactions, and it's not easy. Like, it's way complicated. And the way that you figure that out is you try things and you watch them die, right? You tell jokes as a junior higher and you watch them crash and burn, and you think, okay, well that didn't work. You say funny things, you make funny voices, and then you watch how people react to that, and you try to refine down who you are, because the response of people is a reflection of how it's a reflection of the gloriousness of what you're doing. Now, I'm not saying that you should just live and die for everybody's reactions, but what I'm saying here is that there's something important to fame that we can learn from this. And that is this, that the shared joy or the shared appreciation of something is not inherently bad. It's not inherently bad. It can become bad. We can misuse that. We can put that in the wrong priority in our life, but it's not inherently bad. In fact, one of the things that's fascinating is God actually makes a whole world and a whole people so that His glory can be enjoyed. You understand how great that is? Like, here's the thing for us. When you're in an audience and you're watching somebody do something amazing on stage, and you can join into that glory by praising it. How many of you guys have ever been to a concert and their band is really good and you're really into it, and your celebration of it is actually it becomes part of the glory. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? And you feel that, and that's why people like going to concerts. People will pay lots of money, not me, because I'm too cheap, but normal people. Normal people will go and they'll pay a lot of money to go to a concert to feel there's a sense of community, but it's not just community with the other people who are cheering, although that's part of it, but there's actually a community with the glory itself that takes place when you're enjoying it, when you're praising it. And that's not a bad thing in and of itself. Well, we have to understand that that's what Christ does. Is Christ radiates the goodness of God. And He radiates the goodness of God, the glory of God, in a way that allows us to participate with it. And so He makes all of creation that we can look at. He makes other people. He makes all of this so that we can participate in the glory of God. And it's through Christ that we participate in God's glory. Now, this happens from the creation of the world all the way through the Old Testament. In fact, a lot of times in the Old Testament, Jesus is present, and He's often present as the angel of the Lord. Let me give you an example. In Judges chapter 13, starting in verse 18, it says, "The angel of the Lord said to him, 'Why do you ask me my name, seeing it is wonderful?'" So this is Manoah, and Manoah's just gotten, and his wife have just gotten some great news that somebody who's going to save the people of Israel is going to be born to them. And they're very excited about it. And he wants to know the angel of the Lord's name. And he says, "Why do you ask my name, seeing it is wonderful?" Basically, my name's too wonderful for you to know, to comprehend, to handle. So Manoah took the young goat with the grain offering and offered it on the rock to the Lord, to the one who works wonders. And Manoah and his wife were watching. So Manoah comes and he makes this offering, and his wife and him stand back, and they're watching this burnt offering take place. And it says in verse 20, "And when the flame went up toward heaven from the altar, the angel of the Lord went up in the flame of the altar. Now Manoah and his wife were watching, and they fell on their faces to the ground." This isn't just an angel. The word angel means messenger. It's kind of like a job description, not necessarily a type of person. And here we have somebody fulfilling the role of giving a message to Manoah and his wife. And he's more than just some spiritual being. This is the angel of the Lord. This is the messenger of the Lord. This is in pre-incarnate Christ that's here doing what Christ does. In fact, some theologians think that anytime the voice of God or His works are manifested, physically manifest in the Old Testament, that you have an example of Christ or His work. As an example, you can think of like the burning bush. They would say that that's Christ. Or the pillar of fire that's leading, that's Christ. That's Christ before He was incarnate, but Christ was always there, always sharing the glory of God so that we can understand it and participate in it, giving light so that we can see the glory of God. He's also involved throughout the Old Testament in providential care. Many of us are familiar with Psalm 23. In fact, almost any time you go to a memorial service or a funeral, you hear that psalm because it's such a psalm of comfort. That Jesus leads us into green pastures and beside still waters. It's showing the glory of God in a more personal way. That God's glory isn't just seen in the greatness of His creation, but in His love and care and concern over us. And then also throughout the Old Testament, you have judgment. And we don't often think of judgment as being part of Christ, because we think of that as Christ's job is more forgiveness, but we shouldn't be fooled. In Revelation chapter 6, verse 15 through 17, it says, "Then the kings of the earth and the great ones and the generals and the rich and the powerful and everyone slave and free hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and rocks, 'Fall on us and hide us from the face of Him who is seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand?'" That's a weird thing to think about, right? The wrath of the Lamb. That's a strange... Has that, outside of the Bible, has that phrase ever been uttered? Do people go, oh, look at that lamb, it's full of wrath, you know? It's almost like Monty Python and the rabbit, right? It's a weird thing to think about, the wrath of the lamb, and yet that's a picture of Christ. It's not, he manifests everything about who God is. God has love and compassion, and so he in grace and mercy, and he manifests that, but God also has judgment and wrath, and he manifests that as well. Now, the second thing that we need to see is that the Son shares through words. And when we get to the New Testament, Jesus is on this earth, and his words are a manifestation of the glory and the goodness of God. Now, why is this important? It's important because when we see the words of God, or we see the words of Jesus, we shouldn't say, well, these are just the words of Jesus. Or we shouldn't do what a lot of people do in the modern world, and they say, if you ask them who Jesus was, they'll say, well, Jesus was a moral person, or Jesus was a good teacher. Because if that's the case, then his words don't necessarily have much of a bearing on who God is at all. Jesus was more than that. Jesus, according to our passage here in Hebrews, it says that God a long time ago spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these days he has spoken to us by his Son. That God is speaking through Jesus, that Jesus is revealing the words of God. Jesus' job is to share the words of God, to share who God is. And so when we read the words of Jesus, you're not just reading the words of some itinerant preacher who was a carpenter but then gave that up for a better gig. You're reading the words of the Son of God, the one who's manifesting God himself. That's a crazy thing to think about, because when you think about who Jesus is and you think about the love and the compassion and the mercy he shows, that's not the compassion of just a normal guy. That's not just a really good guy, a nice guy that was wandering around. He's revealing who God himself, the creator of the universe, is. He's sharing with us the nature of the creator of the universe, who we could not possibly know if it weren't for Jesus manifesting who he is. We're told that in the beginning was the Word. And there's a need to form thoughts, to make distinctions. You have to do this in order to separate yourself from everything in the world, and in order to combine yourself with things in the world. There's this thing that has to happen. If you have a newborn baby, they don't know enough to know who they are or what they are. They just have sensory experiences. They don't have any way to formulate those. They don't know that the world doesn't revolve around them. You know, that's one of the interesting things about babies. When you take care of a baby, when you have a newborn baby, does it care that you haven't slept in 3 days when it screams all night long? Does it care? No. It never occurs to the baby at all that there's anything in the world outside of itself and its own needs. It can't distinguish itself from the rest of the world. And then what happens is you see this taking place as the baby discovers that it has these arms and legs. Before that, it's moving. It doesn't know that it's moving them. There's no relationship between the baby and its arms and legs. And pretty soon, it figures out, hey, these are mine, and I can move them and do stuff with them. It's separating itself from the world. And then later, when it knows who it is, it can combine itself with the world. It says, like my grandson, Mason, when he's given the little tool that he can talk with, gets up at like 4 o'clock in the morning and pushes the popcorn button over and over again. Popcorn, 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 popcorn. It's not time for popcorn. Popcorn, popcorn, popcorn. No, you're not having popcorn right now. It's too early. Popcorn, 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 right? He knows what popcorn is. It's something separate from him, but he wants it to be one with him. You see, you can only do that because you have words. You have the ability to make these distinctions. Words in the dividing and combining of the world are fundamental to us in our life. And what Jesus does is he proclaims the word, the separations and the unions of God himself. And one of the things that Jesus proclaims is he proclaims himself as king. Now, we don't understand how important these words are. In John chapter 15, verse 1 through 3, Jesus says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. Already you are clean because of the word that I have spoken to you. That's a really strange thing. Why is it that they're clean? Because of the word that he's spoken to them. Well, if you remember Isaiah, remember that when he's taken up in this vision of the throne room of God, he says, woe is me, I am ruined. I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. You guys remember that? And there's a coal that's taken out of the altar, and it's touched to his lips, and it says there that we fixed that for you, right? We've taken care of that. And it's a strange situation, and you think, well, what's going on here? But think about it this way. You understand that there are two types of problems that we experience in language. There are two types. The first type of problem is vulgarity. If you see something or you hear something that's vulgar, you hear somebody talking in a vulgar way, what are they doing? They're taking something that's low and they're elevating it. They're taking something that's low and they're bringing it into the wrong place, the wrong situation, the wrong company, the wrong, you know what I'm saying? They're elevating it and they're making it normal. They're making it good. And then there's another problem that we have with language, and that's profanity. And when you profane something, you're taking something high and you're bringing it low. You're making it common. Like taking the Lord's name in vain. That's a profanity. So these are the two problems that we have in language. Now, you ask yourself, well, who cares? Why is this important? And I'm sure there's a lot of comedians that would say that, because that's kind of what a lot of comedians, that's what their repertoire consists of, is either profanities or vulgarities. Now, there's a reason why this is a problem. And that reason is that it fundamentally destroys the distinctions that God makes and God is. And you say, well, what? I don't understand. So what? Well, it makes a huge difference. We say God is the most glorious thing that exists. Well, there needs to be a distinction between what is glorious and what is not. If God is the greatest thing, if God is the most wonderful thing, if God is the most awesome thing, if God is the most just thing, if God is the most merciful thing, God is the most loving thing, He is the greatest thing that exists, then we have to have degrees for all those things. And our language is what gives us the ability to make degrees of all those things. And if our language destroys the separations that give us those degrees, then we find ourselves completely lost. You can't separate a God who is above all things if your language won't allow you to separate that God from all other things. You can think about it this way. I was watching a show, a documentary, and it was about the drug problem in the United States. And it showed a guy that, and I'm sorry that this is gonna be one of those things that's almost vulgar, okay? It showed a guy that had a problem, and the problem was that he had been shot at one point in his life. So he was living on the streets, he was a drug addict, and a drug deal went bad, and he got shot. And so some of what should have been on the inside of him was on the outside of him. And he had lived like that for years and years and years. Basically, if he pulled up his shirt, you would see stuff that belonged on the inside of him. He had lived like that for years. And it was killing him. And the producer of the television show asked him, why don't you go to the hospital and get this fixed? And he says, well, when it first happened, I was at the hospital and they were going to fix it, but I left the hospital. Why did you leave? I needed drugs. And what happened was the drug dealer, as they were sitting there talking, the drug dealer of that neighborhood came into view, and this guy had some money in his hand, and so he ran down the street to this guy holding his stomach so that more of what was on the inside didn't come out. Now, here's the thing. Most of us, hopefully, I can see from your faces this is a horrible thing for you to hear. I apologize. But do you understand that in order for this situation to be resolved, that guy has to see it as horrible? Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, until he looks at this and says, this is horrible, then he's not going to do the things necessary to change that about himself. He's not, you know what I'm saying? He has to have a scale, and in that scale, he has to say, this is unacceptable. This is so terrible. This is so awful. There's nothing, nobody should live like this. I've got to get myself together. I've got to do whatever it takes to solve this problem. You know, we say this all the time. We say that to people, that you can't change until you hit rock bottom. But the problem is that a lot of people are at rock bottom, but they don't know it. And they don't know it because the things that they say to themselves cover up the fact that they're at rock bottom. And that's the way that it works in our world. Our language is so important because we can't separate those things that are so awful and terrible that we should never, ever experience them, and nobody else should ever experience them, from the things that are so wonderful that we can't possibly hope to spend even 1 second near them. We have to have this range of language in order to see God for who He is, and it's important to see God for who He is. Because the third thing that we need to talk about is the Son shares in actions. It's not just words that the Son shares in, but it's also in actions. Jesus heals on the Sabbath. He feeds the 5,000. He shows constant care and concern for the lost. And He's constantly surrounded by the crowds who need Him. And you understand from reading the Gospels that He's just constantly on the verge of exhaustion in meeting the needs of people. No matter where He goes, it'll say that the crowds kind of surround Him and press in. And so He'll get in a boat and go to the other side of a lake. And then when He gets there, the crowds surround Him and press in on Him. And it can't turn them away, but He heals their sick. Now, why would somebody go through all of that? If you've had a family of any size, you understand that there are times when you just need to go out in the garage and fix something. Right? You have to go out in the garage and fix something. Not because anything needs to be fixed, but because just for a minute, you need to kind of get away from all the things that need to be fixed. Now, what I'm saying here is that we all have our limits, and we get pushed to our limits, and we make sacrifices. But what motivates those sacrifices? We were talking this week in our small groups about Abraham and Isaac. And you guys know the story, right? Abraham and Isaac, that Abraham is called by God to take his son Isaac, who he's been waiting forever for. And he's supposed to take him up to a mountain and sacrifice him there. And so he does it. At least he starts off the process, right? He goes up, he gets everything together, goes up the mountain, binds his son, puts him on the altar, does all that stuff, and has the knife ready to go when God stops him. And we're talking about how when you look at that, it seems to make God monstrous. And so we just started discussing the idea of sacrifice, and we looked at the idea of Cain and Abel and what their sacrifice was, and the fact that they seemed to know somehow that God had accepted one of their sacrifices and not the other, and how does that all work? And it's important to understand something about sacrifice, the nature of sacrifice and what it does. You know what sacrifice is? It's the manifestation of the hierarchy of the value system that you establish in your words. That's what a sacrifice is. That's what a sacrifice does. It makes real, it puts into action the things that you tell yourself about what you really believe and what you really value. And one of the things that's fascinating about the Cain and Abel story is, remember that Cain is downcast when God doesn't accept his sacrifice. And we don't know, how does he know God doesn't? And what's the deal anyway? Like, what is he losing out on? We don't know. It doesn't tell us. It just tells us that he knows that God hasn't accepted it and that he's downcast. Here's the thing. And I know I don't have to spend a lot of time convincing you of this because I know, because you're a human being, you know what I'm talking about. When you tell yourself that certain things are valuable to you, but then you don't live that out, you get depressed. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? You say to yourself, my family's really important. And then you realize that you haven't been spending enough time there. It's not like you say to yourself, woohoo, this is great news. You say that somebody is important to you or something's valuable to you. You say even something like, you tell yourself, hey, I need to lose weight, but then you don't do anything about it. You feel good about that? You go home and you celebrate that? We don't, do we? It's important for us to understand this. That the words Jesus uses show God to be something that's so amazing, that the love and the grace and the mercy of God, the power of God, Jesus' words show God to be something utterly profound and utterly amazing. The way he goes around and when he's with sinners and the religious leaders give him all kinds of grief about it, he says, it's not the well who need a doctor, it's the sick. I came to seek and to save the lost. Those words are necessary. Because without those words, you don't get the picture of God that leads to Jesus sacrificing himself on the cross. In Luke chapter 23, verse 33 and 34, there's this amazing passage. It says, and when they came to the place that is called the Skull, there they crucified him, and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Now this is important. Jesus is being sacrificed amongst criminals. He's being treated as a criminal. And Jesus said, now think about this for a moment. How many of you guys have ever experienced injustice in your life? This last week, maybe for the last 2 or 3 weeks, probably for the last 3 weeks, I have been behind more slow people than ever in my entire life. There's a lot of people that look very unimpressed with my story of woe here. You don't understand. This is serious now. I've been behind more slow people, and it's all I can do. I mean, it's oppressive. Now, obviously, I'm not serious about that. Now, here's the thing. No, I'm serious about the fact that I've been behind slow people, but I understand there's a scale of oppression in the world, and mine's pretty small. Here's the thing, though. When we see Jesus on the cross, Jesus is being victimized in a way that nobody ever in the planet has ever been victimized. There's never been somebody perfect who's died that kind of death for crimes that they were completely innocent of. And by completely innocent, I mean completely innocent. Now, here's the thing. There's been a lot of people in the world who have gotten executed for things that they didn't do. But there's also a lot of things that they did in their life that they didn't get caught for, right? And I'm not saying that all of those or any of those in their life would warrant the death penalty, but at least they had things in their past. Jesus was perfect. He was completely perfect. He was completely innocent. And the people who should have been praising him are the ones that are putting him to death. Jesus is experiencing the ultimate betrayal and the ultimate injustice here. And so what do you expect Jesus to say on the cross? I would expect at the least idiots. You guys are idiots. Don't you know who I am? You would expect something. You would expect Jesus to say something like that. It says, and when they came to that place that is called the Skull, they were where they crucified him and the criminals, on his right and one on his left. And Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Jesus' words show God to be something that is so profound, that God is a God of such extravagant and immeasurable love and grace that he even loves those people that are his enemies. Those people that have rebelled against him. Those people not just have rebelled against him, not just spoken against him, not just ignored him. When Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, his words are setting up a value system. They're pointing to a God who loves his enemies. But this is the farthest extreme of this you can, that Jesus' actions are displaying in this sacrifice what the words really meant. Jesus is actually praying for the people who are at that moment killing him. This isn't like a theoretical, oh yeah, those guys don't like me much, they're my enemies. When Jesus talks about loving your enemies and praying for those who persecute you, this is what he's talking about. This is what he's demonstrating in his life. This is what sacrifice means. It means embodying what you've talked about. And Jesus is sharing with us the glory of God, that God, even in the midst of us killing him, loves us enough to want to redeem us. How many times in your life have you thought to yourself, after this, God can't love me? After this, God can't love me. With what I've done, God could never love me. God could never forgive me for this. Jesus is praying for the people who are killing him. And he's revealing the character and the nature of God, the creator of the universe, the creator of you. It's Jesus' job to share, to make visible, to make known the glory of God. There's not anything more that God could do to demonstrate who he is. You know, I talked about scary movies, and it's interesting that in scary movies you always have some, you know, you have Jason or you have Freddy or you have some guy that has a normal name apparently, and he chases you down, and no matter what you can do, no matter what you do, you can't get away from him, you can't stop him. He always just walks, you know, strolls along, and you're running, and then all of a sudden he's there. How did he get there? Who knows? You can't, but you run upstairs, he's there, you run in the basement, he's always there. You can't get away from him, you can't stop him. And the thing is that has to be the embodiment of this thing. And I thought, you know, what's kind of like that? I was thinking, well, a virus, right? That's the really terrifying thing, but you can't make a movie about that. So they give somebody, some enemy, the properties of a virus. But even more frightening than a virus, you know what's the most frightening thing? It's doubt. Because it'll follow you anywhere, you can't get away from it. And sometimes it seems like you can't kill it. There's nothing in the world that's immune from doubt. Jesus has revealed the nature and the character of the living God, the one who created you. And it's not immune from your doubt. You can look at what Jesus did and you can say, I don't believe it. But understand that there's nothing more that God could show you about how he loves you and that he wants a relationship with you. In Jesus, you have the fullness of God. The passage says that he is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. That is who God is. And it's up to us to take his word for it and his actions. So finally, how do we apply this? Well, one, believe that God has adopted you as a son. No matter what you've done, he has brought you into his family. And then secondly, belong to that family. We have our small groups as a way of doing that, so please be a part of those if you can. And then finally, lastly, become incandescent. Be transformed by the love of God so that you become somebody like Jesus who radiates the love of God. You will not be sorry.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page, where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out all of our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian Church, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to His church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at www.fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week.